The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to HackSurfer's weekly podcast. Today's date is Friday, January 16th, 2015. Joining us today for the podcast, we have Michael Feld, Surfwatch Labs data analyst, Jeff Peters, the editor of HackSurfer, and I'm Matt Lightfuss. I write for HackSurfer. A little later after the podcast, join us for Jeff's interview with Sam Curry. Curry's the new CTO and CSO of Arbor Networks. And Jeff and Curry discuss DDoS and other cyber trends. So to kick it off this week, guys, I thought we could talk about some new proposed cybersecurity legislation from President Barack Obama. There's three different proposals here. One of them is a new breach notification law. It would require companies to inform consumers of a breach within 30 days. Another proposal, it has to do with information sharing. Under this legislation would give liability protection to companies or individuals that are sharing information. And the third part are stronger charges for cyber criminals. I thought we could start here today, guys. Jeff, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say about any of this. This is all new to me. I mean, this is a new development.
Yeah, Matt. So I actually got a few emails from a few different companies sending along quotes, and it seemed that they're generally pretty positive, kind of in sentiment. You know, this is sort of a step in the right direction. I think those three areas are areas that a lot of people that we've been interviewing have been complaining about. You know, it's sort of this need for sort of a national standard versus 48 different ones, sort of the need for more information sharing. You can kind of argue, I guess, over the third part, whether we need stronger charges. I think the debate with that largely comes down to, you know, white hat hackers, and there's been a lot of complaint I've seen in a lot of different articles, just people talking about how obviously, you know, you try to crack down on hackers, and then what happens is you end up cracking down on researchers because they're doing positive hacking things, but they could potentially be held liable, and you know, obviously you don't want to be researching some vulnerability and end up going to prison for 10 years because of it. But yeah, I think the general sentiment is that, you know, it's good that they're trying to do something. And I think Congress, you could argue, is pretty reactionary sometimes. And with all this stuff happening in the news, I think they want to do something. The question is if it'll happen, when it'll happen, and what the laws will actually look like at that time.
Yeah, and Jeff, to add, just to pump the brakes on this is proposed legislation. And, you know, Congress hasn't even looked at it. And in reality, it would probably be a significant amount of time before this actually becomes law. But again, these are steps in the right direction. I'm skeptical on some parts of these laws, specifically the information sharing. You know, granted, it's important and they give people liability protection, but in the end, so what? It comes down to if you're a business and you're getting pummeled with alerts from different ISACs or different other sorts of organizations or tools that you're using in your enterprise, you're getting so much information that something may fall through the cracks. Even though these are important first steps, you just have to pump the brakes and see how, in the longer term, everything really develops.
I guess another interesting thing is the fact that President Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron are actually meeting at the White House today. David Cameron's been saying a lot of interesting things about encryption. That's been getting a lot of backlash from security people, basically just saying that I guess the government should have, you know, full right to be able to decrypt all this stuff. Kind of similar to what the FBI director was saying earlier, I think a couple months ago back in September, was criticizing Apple for their encryption and basically making it harder for law enforcement. So he's meeting with Obama today, and I know one of the things that he wants to discuss is, you know, Facebook and Google being able to share sort of encrypted data with law enforcement. And that's one of the things that he's going to be pushing for. I mean, who knows what will happen with that, though. But also in the government sector, probably one of the biggest stories of the week was the CENTCOM social media breach. I don't know if you want to tell us a little bit about what happened, Matt.
Yeah, so it was pretty embarrassing for, the government and Obama, because as he was announcing these proposals, this was happening. Pro-ISIS followers were able to deface the CENTCOM social media sites, for Twitter and YouTube. And all of this now, this whole, everything involved in this has been on the tops of all trending cybercrime chatter, YouTube, Twitter, CENTCOM, everything that has to deal with it. When we think of ISIS, we think of terrorists and everything else, but now they're really kind of getting into this hacktivist group, and I thought that was really interesting.
Well, just reviewing from the Surfwatch Labs data point of view, this vandalism caused quite a bit of noise, but if you really look at how the bigger picture, in the end, they were just hijacking social media accounts. They didn't obtain any sensitive data. They just kind of threw mud at the face of CENTCOM. So the media is really kind of taken off with this, and there's so much noise and chatter, but if you really look at it, it's a shrug of your shoulders. There's not really that big a deal. But I think to the larger point, what Matt discussed is, I think there's a new trend in the hacktivist sort of set of groups where a lot of these groups now are inspired by Islamic radicalism, and they're using their abilities to deface websites, launch DDoS attacks, what have you. And it'd be interesting to kind of look at who some of these people or specific people are and their backgrounds, to see what else they could be capable of.
Yeah, it's always been something that I found kind of interesting, and especially like last year, it was a lot with the Syrian Electronic Army. Everyone was talking about the SEA and all the stuff that they were doing, but, in terms of cybercrime, I guess that's kind of why I always have sort of a vendetta for hacktivists. It's just they get so much attention in the media for basically causing so little relative to, other things that are much more important that we should be talking about.
And it's also another point is it's interesting in the media, just looking at how you have a very good point about how their activities are very low impact, but the media, for whatever reason, really follows and blows up what actually happened, where in reality they just either defaced a website or they launched a DDoS, denial service attack, against something that really doesn't really matter. But it's an interesting point to talk about.
And it's interesting too because I was gonna say it's interesting because like that's exactly what obviously the hacktivists want. They want you to talk about their stupid little defacement message, that the U.S. is against Syria and or for like the SEA or so it's kind of like the media does their job being the perfect echo chamber for these hacktivist groups. But it's kind of a side tangent. Also this week, the head of the cyber defense for the French military said that they had been targeted with 19,000 websites had been targeted since the anti-terror demonstrations that have been going on over there. He said it's the first time that a country has been faced with such a large wave. Most of the attacks were minor DDoS attacks, and they hit a wide variety of sites like military regiments, pizza shops, things like that. So it's just kind of more of a minor nuisance really than anything too serious. But I guess there is the potential that something more serious could happen besides just website defacements and DDoS attacks and things like that. And it is kind of interesting, just kind of going off the podcast a couple weeks ago, we were talking about more nation states getting involved, but also a lot more, groups like ISIS and these hacktivists or terror groups, whatever you want to call them, sort of turning to the cyber arena as well. Was there any other interesting news this week, Matt?
Yeah, so when we took a look at some of Surfwatch Labs data, there was a lot of new events happening, but one that really caught my eye, it had to do with the ransomware attack. Over New Year's, around that time, the Huffington Post's Canadian website and LA Weekly websites they found malicious ads. And typically with these attacks, from what I understand when I read this article, the ransomware attack, they demand $300, and to try to embarrass and really get them to play along with the program. They do research, the hackers do research into the user's URL to see if they've looked at any adult sites, and they kind of use that into the ransom note. Probably what I found the most interesting from everything I read was it was pointing, a lot of the articles were pointing to administrative responsibilities on these websites to check them for malicious content. Now, I don't think we talk about that a whole lot. We talk about the threats that are out there. That's something that we've never really talked about. And another thing I would like to talk about with ransomware is, why are they so effective?
Well, yeah, that's one of the interesting things, is that obviously this ransomware is working. I mean, you read these articles about them making, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars off these different pieces of ransomware. And I think it's so effective because most consumers don't really back up their stuff. So like if you look at it on an individual level, if you have all your family photos on your computer and all of a sudden you get a message saying, hey, for $300, or give us $300 or you're never going to get your family photos back. A lot of people seem to be paying it. And then on the business level, it could be even more dangerous with all the potential information that you could lose. So I think that's why they're so effective. And then also it's a very direct way for cyber criminals to make money. It's not like you have to steal something and try to sell it. So I think it's definitely appealing to criminals in that way as well.
One interesting aspect of use of ransomware is I've read several articles about what's happened to some people, and a lot of the people who are being compromised are older folks, and they actually have a lot of struggle understanding what has happened, first of all. But then if they want to pay for whatever reason, they can't pay because the attackers want bitcoins. And first of all, a lot of older folks don't know what bitcoins are. I bet you if I asked my parents what bitcoins were, they would scratch their head. And even a lot of younger people don't know what bitcoins are. But I think that's one big struggle for people who are infected with ransomware is if they choose that not only don't update their data, but if they do choose to pay the ransom, there is no way of them understanding or knowing how to do it.
Yeah, another interesting thing. This was actually probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I was working someplace and I met some guy and he was freaking out because his computer had the old the FBI has locked your computer. Screen was on there. This website's been locked by the FBI. You have to pay your $200 fine right here or whatever it said. For looking at child pornography or something. And you're like, oh my goodness, I did look at an adult site not too long ago. And you freak out and you just. That embarrassment factor works and people just want it to go away, and some people think it's actually a serious thing. Yeah, so that's it for our discussion this week. Moving on to the cyber tip of the week. There was a recent story about American and United Airlines customer accounts being broken into and hackers basically using, some of those mileage or points or whatever you want to call them from their loyalty programs to book free trips and upgrades. But the interesting thing about that story is that it appears that the intruders simply reused previously stolen credentials. So I think that's just a good point to make. I know you can stress it again and again and again, don't reuse credentials. But this was, a pretty high-profile example that's been getting a lot of coverage of people reusing their credentials and then having the information stolen. And then I was reading some of the articles and, it's kind of funny because all these people are complaining about how, it's the airline's fault that, these people hacked into their accounts. And I was thinking, well, no, it's because you reused your credentials. It's your fault. So don't reuse credentials. We'll say it again and again and again.
And invest in a password manager.
That's it for this week's chat. Moving on, we have a interview with Sam Curry. We talked to him this morning. He's the new CTO and CSO of Arbor Networks. And we chat about DDoS, cyber trends, and a few other things. I wanted to get a couple thoughts on a few different DDoS-related items. The big story recently is, Lizard Squad taking down, Sony and Xbox networks. for a business kind of looking at it who doesn't really know much about DDoS or doesn't understand it too much, when you see huge companies like Microsoft and Sony basically told that they're going to be attacked, and then they are attacked, and they still can't quite stop it, I can kind of see why some businesses might kind of have the perception that there's really not much they can do about DDoS. Just kind of wonder if you could maybe elaborate on that thought a little bit.
Well, I think DDoS has really hit the media and become quite popular, at least visible. It's become almost a household name in some ways, as associated with major world events. It's something that nation states seem to throw at one another. It's something that criminals use to throw at Wall Street. And so there's a sense of massive floods of traffic moving around, and the companies sitting at the end of pipes don't have much control or ability to do things, and nothing could be further from the truth. I think of DDoS as saturation that overwhelms in series either a link or pipe. It can overwhelm a set of sessions at a gateway. It can overwhelm applications, systems, and databases. And at each of those stages, there are options for companies to really make sure that they're robust, that they're hardened, that they can resist that, and they don't have to just sit there and wait for the inevitable flood to come. They can actually take matters into their own hands. It doesn't have to be particularly difficult, but they can be prepared both in partnership with people like us, but also with cloud providers and ISPs, and on-premise to be ready for if and when they become the target of anything from hacktivism or cybercrime to nation states. So be prepared for when geopolitics does that. And I think DDoS is frankly going to continue to become more sophisticated, more complex. And with old Metcalfe's law, and if you throw in Moore's law and a few others for good measure, we're just going to have more systems able to put out more traffic. And so it makes sense to start thinking in terms of being able to stop the floods and also to look for the needle in the haystack, because very often DDoS is used as a cloak or diversion from more surgical strikes.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because that's something when we interview people, a lot of people always talk about using DDoS as a diversion. Just maybe wondering if you could explain to the people listening, how that works, and if they're under a DDoS attack, what else they should be looking out for.
Sure, there's a really cool physical analogy here. Some folks may have heard of this. It's called Locard's principle. Locard was a 19th century criminologist who figured out that there's always an exchange of evidence between a criminal and a crime scene. So if you stab someone, you're always going to have a DNA, fingerprint left behind, or a little fingerprint or DNA or dirt or hair sample or something. And it's proven true in the physical world. And in the digital world, that's also true, that whenever you do good or bad things on a network, you leave a digital wake. You leave logs behind. You are visible in packet captures, in packet streams, and flow. And it's the job of forensics teams to go hunt that down, both hunters and post-event, the folks who go in afterwards and see what really happened. It's a lot like CSI. If you like shows like Bones or NCSI or whatever the popular one is right now, if you like those sorts of shows, that happens in the digital world too. And so when you throw DDoS at it, it's the equivalent in the forensic world of going to a crime scene and spreading around hair samples from 1,000 barbershops, right? So it makes it much harder to find this signal that you're looking for, the signal that represents the bad guy in the noise and the saturation. And of course, not all traffic is the same. It could all look very homogeneous and simple to filter out, but the truly scary ones are the distributed ones that are distributed both geographically and in terms of connection types and protocols in use. So it makes it very difficult, both from a find the signal perspective when you're doing forensics, and also to keep up with the volume, because you just storage can be an issue. So if you're used to these finely tuned forensic investigation devices to comb through data, and suddenly you find you don't just have a couple of gig, you've got terabytes of information for a short period of time, you might not even be able to keep it all. And so eventually you start dropping packets, you start dropping information, and you're losing data, you're losing evidence. So what folks do is, if you're a bad guy and you want to break in somewhere, you want to do something that could draw a lot of attention from an investigative team, you improve your odds of success by saturating the defenses. You both create a distraction that ties up people. You potentially can waste storage, and you make it much harder to find the bad thing that you're doing in that traffic.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I guess over the past year, there's really been a lot of talk about, sort of ransom attacks, especially like ransomware and things. But on the DDoS side, we've seen that a little bit as well with, there was quite a few, sort of high public cases, even where, they were only demanding $500 or something. But is that a trend that you see continuing? I guess, from my point of view, that seems kind of the most direct way to get money is just, to threaten someone and try to extort them.
Yeah, the internet is fundamentally an anonymous environment. It's very hard to prove things, especially where people are from and what they're doing, without really going to great lengths. And so I think you could probably boil this down as a simple ROI equation. There's money to be made, right? So this is the path to lots of money. I mean, Willie Sutton, I think, was falsely attributed to saying, "Why do you rob banks?" And he said, because that's where the money is. And so if there's money to get, and let's keep in mind that our personal lives are very digitized. It's very hard to tell where my physical life and my digital life actually have a seam or a separation. So the incentive is there. The bad guys will go after it. And for more and more money over time as we become more digitized. And the simplicity is there. It's easy to do. And here's the important thing, the anonymous part. It's really hard to enforce this stuff. It's really hard to actually hold somebody accountable and enforce it in a court of law. And as long as that equation stays the same, as long as we don't have treaties for international enforcement or to be stronger in persecuting these crimes, and as long as it's easy for the bad guys to do, then it will continue. And it's sad, but this type of extortion happens. In the case of ransomware, where your data is personally held ransom, then I've seen many people who are forced to make the tough decision between paying $500 or losing all their family photos or key files in terms of IP for their job. And then when you scale it up to companies, it's really hard. This is an extension, and make no mistake, it's an extension of the exact same sort of crime that used to happen with the abduction of executives or key employees or that sort of behavior. So as long as we have an environment where it's possible, you can expect it to thrive. And that is sad, but it's something we should be all preparing for.
Yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts if there's any other, I guess, trends that kind of stick out in your mind or interesting things, in regards to DDoS.
Well, actually, yeah. Very interesting is the interplay among the actors. If you talk to a security person in a company or in a government, they very often talk about, well, these actors behave this way and these ones behave that way. We'll give you some examples. The cyber criminals are financially motivated. They're not politically motivated. And the old term advanced persistent threat, which usually means nation states or non-state actors, are agenda-driven. And hacktivists, they're over here and they do their own thing by their ethos, depending on the kind. First of all, they interplay with each other. So they both share data. And in some cases, they publish tools so that the other actors pick them up and are then later something that can be compromised. So you sometimes see nation states publishing tools picked up by cyber criminals that let them then go and steal those botnets for distributed denial of service. And what's more is there's also a movement of people. So if you happen to be working in a government agency for nefarious purposes and then an opportunity comes up to go into the private sector and work in cybercrime, you don't pass the opportunity up. And sometimes the lines are becoming very blurred. And I expect that to continue. And now we're seeing the tools that used to be used by just one set of attackers used by all. And so I think we can start to talk less categorically about different types of attackers. And we need to start thinking in terms of all of them being interchangeable and their toolkits and their methodology. And any trick out there that the bad guys learn is potentially available to all of them. So this isn't necessarily a cause for concern because I think we need to be aware of it, but we ultimately need to be forging, shall we say, a coalition of the good to overwhelm the coalition of the bad. I think that there are far more, if you add up all the security departments in governments and in companies and the folks out there who are security practitioners, we still outnumber the bad guys, and we still have an ability to get a community effect going. And really get advantages too.
I guess it was probably about a year ago we started doing these interviews, and one of the first ones we did was after there was that study that came out about a botnet, using a fridge, and there's all the headlines about fridges being used for DDoS attacks and smart TVs. So I guess it's been about a year since that was kind of making a bunch of waves and headlines. Curious your thoughts if that's just kind of a little sideshow distraction, or if that's something that people should be concerned about, and then if they are concerned, what the heck are they supposed to do about it?
I think it is an object of concern, but the question is when. I remember the talks in 2002 and 2003 of the year of mobile malware, for instance, and you can think of many examples where people have thought of these theoretically horrendous things, and they do eventually become threats The question is, when does it arrive as a non-stochastic, meaning a sustained thing? When does it become a phenomenon that we all have to worry about and start to prepare for? So forward-looking is good, and I think this Internet of Things, it is both over and underhyped, and much like the Internet was in its day, that it will change so much, and security is a massive concern. But I think it's a little bit early to worry about a denial of service from every washing machine in the country. However, having said that, bandwidth will continue to increase, and it is undeniable that we will be faced with a world in short order with 100 billion network devices. So if those can be hijacked, if those can be stolen, and we know they will be, then we do have to be concerned about it and start preparing for it now. It's just not an imminent threat, I think, in the next month or two.
Yeah, so kind of moving away from DDoS and getting a little more big picture. You said you had 20 years experience, so I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on. There's been a lot of articles and discussion about how the C-suite and board of directors are getting more involved, and there's a lot more, I guess, concern and people being held accountable for cybersecurity at organizations. So wondering if you have any kind of experience with that, or if you've noticed any kind of shift in mindset in that regard.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think the biggest problem through most of the last 15 to 5 years ago, so around 2000 to 2010-ish, I think the biggest problem was that the CIO was really trying to be an equal player in the C-suite. They weren't just attacks on the business, and I think that's over. I think it's now well understood that most companies are fundamentally digital companies. Not all, but most. And I think now the CISO is going through a similar transition where he or she is trying to be seen as the real custodian of IT risk, that they're the person who is responsible for managing and mitigating it and really speaking the business language for it to be understood. Now, having said that, the long tail of companies still really are very immature from a security perspective and are struggling to be able to sit in the C-suite and talk to the board. At the top end, you always have the ones who are, the early adopters or the leaders, and they have a full right to be there. Many companies and many CISOs that I talk to at the large enterprise end of the spectrum in many verticals do regular discussions with the board. They talk monthly or quarterly, and they don't just report on how many viruses did we stop, right? It's what's the landscape, what are the threats that we're concerned about, and meaningfully, how do we measure our robustness and key metrics that matter and map to risk. And that conversation is getting richer. And they're frankly going to pave the way, I think, for the rapid movement of the rest of the industries. And I say industries plural because by vertical it can vary enormously. Some are stuck in a compliance rut, some don't care. And of course, some of the small and medium-sized enterprises don't have enough mass to pay for a significant security department. So I actually expect, with things like cloud adoption, I expect the CISO to become more of a custodian. Actually, I would say more of a broker than a custodian. So their job will be to make sure that security is done right in the fabric of the company without having to hire an army of people to do it. They'll be less responsible for the day-to-day operations than they are for making sure that security is in the DNA of a given company. And that's pretty exciting. But right now we're seeing an acceleration, right? It's getting faster, the rate at which security is moving up in an organization and the business is paying attention. But it's not an easy journey for most.
Yeah, I was reading an earlier interview you had done on Arbor, and you said being a CTO is in your blood. So I guess another sort of trend we always see is a lot of these articles about the cybersecurity skills gap and, how there's companies can't find enough qualified people. Just wondering your thoughts on that, if you think that's something that exists and if it's getting better or worse.
Yeah, the CTO is in my blood I think it's important because most companies have a long tail of things they know they have to build, right? There's the requirements list that goes on forever. And then most of engineering, by the way, is actually sort of execution. You assign the right number of people to hit the right scope in the right time with the right quality. That's the challenge of engineering. A lot of people forget that you can't plan in that way to build the things you don't know how to build yet. And so a CTO's job is partly to do advanced development. It's to break through scientific boundaries in how we do what we do, to feed into engineering to make the next generation of products. And in doing that, it's to drive internal change, but it's business and technical change, meaning you can innovate all you want, but if it doesn't actually get out into the hands of real customers really using it, then it's just really useless. Nothing has happened. So CTOs have to be the bridge between technology and the business. They have to drive internal change. They also have to be the face in many ways, internally and externally, for what a company can do. Here at Arbor, we have some amazing technologies. It's my job to make sure the world knows that what we can do, for instance, in research or in investigation, and in addition to DDoS. And then on the CISO side, my job is to make sure that I have the world's best, or one of the world's best, and leading ways of hunting the bad guys, that actually finding folks in my own networks and set an example and consume both my products and other products to do that. The skills challenge is a tough one. And I say this very often. I look for the right attitude as opposed to necessarily the right skill set, because we can train people. You always have to have a core, a cadre of people who are really good. They know their stuff. They're deeply versed in networking, computing, security in general. So I can unleash them at, for instance, a PCAP, and they will find the needle in the haystack. But I can also take a great person with the right attitude and almost paranoia, the right learning, and very rapidly get them functional. So somebody with a music background, or a math background, or even a literature background, if they have the right approach to learning, an approach to hunting, an approach to following, let's say, learning security, they are as good an initial candidate, and I can get them to be a really good cyber person within a few months. And so I would encourage, there is a skill deficit right now around security. I would encourage folks who are hiring to look to raise their eyes up, pick them up from looking myopically right in front of you for the perfect security candidate, and look for the person who could be perfect. Look for the person who has the right moxie and the right attitude, the right approach, and turn them into that, and will actually make the country stronger into the bargain.
Thanks for taking the time, and congrats on your new position.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen. And be sure to check out surfwatchlabs.com for more information.